And a new show is what's facing American comedy star Carol Burnett. From early rehearsals to opening night on Broadway, Storyville captures all the uncertainties tonight at 11:15 here on BBC Two.
How am I going to live until the bank opens? I need money.
Now listen to me. I beg of you not to do this thing.
How much do you need?
Hey!
This Christmas, think of everything going wrong. Have a good cry. And imagine having never been born.
This is a chance of a lifetime.
Only BBC Two can make you feel this good this Christmas. It's a Wonderful Life, Christmas Eve at 6:35 on BBC Two.
Smith's the name, now on BBC Two.
Are you going to confess to how many pints you had?
I can't remember.
My maidhood, honour, truth, and everything. I love thee so.
Minx. Some are born great, some achieve greatness, and some have greatness thrust upon them.
I pity you. That's a degree to love.
12th night, 6:05, Christmas Day on BBC Two.
Most wonderful.
Time season, launching the BBC's Millennium, coming soon on BBC Two.
Now on BBC Two, Gordon Brewer with Newsnight.
Why didn't Peter Mandelson declare a huge loan he'd been given by his ministerial colleague? We'll be speaking to him live on Newsnight tonight. Good evening. The government was hit tonight by new allegations of conflict of interest. It's alleged that Peter Mandelson, the Trade and Industry Secretary, borrowed almost £400,000 from the Paymaster General, Geoffrey Robinson, to buy a house. The loan was made 2 years ago, but the Prime Minister apparently learned of it only last week. I'll be asking Mr Mandelson why he didn't mention this sooner, and whether he believes prominent politicians should be borrowing this kind of money from prominent businessmen who then end up in their government. Tonight, the Prime Minister again proclaimed the operation against Saddam Hussein a success. But there's a growing sense of unease about whether the military action was really necessary. So what was it all about? We'll be reporting not only on the scale of damage to Saddam Hussein's war machine, but also the collateral damage done to the international coalition against Saddam. I'll be asking Derek Fatchett, the Foreign Office Minister, whether there's now any hope of forging a new consensus. Bill Clinton visited a soup kitchen today, while behind the scenes his aides were desperately trying to avoid the bitter gruel of an impeachment hearing in the Senate. Peter Marshall is in Washington.
After the shame and hostility of the impeachment vote, I've been talking to senators and those close to the White House about what happens next. The stakes are, of course, enormous.
Tony Blair's had some year. He started as master of all he surveyed. He's still riding high in the polls. But is everything as rosy as it seems? Mark Mardell has our review of the year in politics. First, the rather bizarre story that's emerging tonight about a £373,000 loan given to the Trade and Industry Secretary, Peter Mandelson, by his colleague, the Paymaster General, Geoffrey Robinson. It happened 2 years ago, before they were in government, but apparently wasn't declared by Mr Mandelson when he became Trade Secretary. The DTI is looking into allegations about Mr Robinson's financial dealings. Mr Mandelson says there's no conflict of interest. Well, I'm joined by our political correspondent Mark Mardell. Mark, first of all, what exactly are the allegations?
Well, I don't think there's any doubt about the facts. The loan did take place. It was nearly £400,000, and it happened when the two men were in opposition before the election, although they're both very senior in the leadership. Now, where the problem allegedly occurs is that Mr Mandelson was promoted in last summer's reshuffle to become the head of the Department of Trade and Industry. Very shortly after that, he was told that they were investigating Geoffrey Robinson, who's the number 3 in the Treasury. Now, he's already a hugely controversial figure. It's widely expected in Westminster that he'll actually resign over the Christmas period. Mr Robinson is hugely controversial. And it's widely expected that he's going to go over the Christmas period because there's been a storm of allegations, none of which, of course, proved over his business interests. But it all started when it was found that he had offshore trusts, and the government was against those. And it's now Mr Mandelson, when he took over, was told that the Department of Trade and Industry was investigating Mr Robinson. And he said nothing about the fact that he had a loan from his friend. Now, evidently, Mr Mandelson felt at the time that was all right because he wasn't actually involved in the investigation himself. None of the ministers were.
How is this going down in Downing Street? Are they taking this seriously?
I think they are taking it seriously. The very fact that Mr Mandelson's out and about talking about this tonight shows that they're taking it seriously. The Prime Minister only found out about this last Thursday. He asked the top civil servant in Whitehall, Sir Richard Wilson, to investigate. He spoke to people in the Department of Trade and Industry, and they said, well, actually, ministers are nothing to do with this investigation. They won't be involved. They won't even be involved at the end of it, when a decision has to be taken about what happens next. So the Prime Minister is evidently said to feel that Peter Mandelson is sufficiently insulated from the whole business.
How do you think Labour Party members will react to this? I mean, after all, Mr Mandelson is not necessarily the most popular figure with rank-and-file Labour Party members.
I think that is perhaps one of the problems. I mean, certainly the Tories are going to make hay with it. They're talking about a government of cronies, and they're trying to establish the image that this government has all the problems of the last one, and it feeds into that, so it's going to help the Conservatives. But I think the basic problem for Mr Mandelson, I don't feel this is a resignation matter or anything like that, but is that, as you say, he's not particularly loved by Labour Party members, and they just won't like the idea that one of the cabinet ministers is getting a huge loan from a friend who's a multimillionaire who's also in the government. It won't go down well.
That's the point, though, isn't it? Whatever's at the bottom of this, New Labour was going to clean up sleaze in politics and all the rest of it after the Tory years. They were going to not only be whiter than white, but be seen by the British public to be whiter than white. And when you get things like this that raise all sorts of questions, even if Mr Mandelson hasn't been involved in the conflict of interest, people are going to think, well, it's all a bit odd, really. I
think it is the perception that's a problem, that if what the DTI is saying is right, and I'm sure it is right, that ministers are completely isolated from this process, then clearly there isn't a conflict of interest. But this government was promising that it would not only be honest, but be seen to be honest, and therefore some people might have expected that Mr Mandelson would actually have said at the time that he took over and got the cabinet job that he had this loan.
Mark Mardell, thanks very much. And Peter Mandelson joins me now from Westminster. Good evening, Mr Mandelson.
Good evening.
First of all, just on the facts about this loan, you said in a statement tonight you were loaned £370,000 by Geoffrey Robinson to assist you in the purchase of a house in London. What sort of loan was this? Do you pay any interest on it, or was there a special interest rate?
The outstanding loan is actually £332,000. I do pay interest on it at a simple base rate. This was an arrangement made between Geoffrey Robinson and myself 2 years ago, before the election, to help me finance the purchase of a home in London.
But
it is a short-term arrangement, and when I'm able to, with the family resources available to me, then I will be able to pay him back the loan, and I expect that to take place shortly.
Presumably you don't pay the sort of interest rates that the average person would pay to their building society, otherwise there'd be no point in borrowing the money from Mr Robinson rather than the Abbey National or than Nationwide.
No, Geoffrey Robinson is a very wealthy man. He's a very generous man. He's a colleague, he's a fellow Labour MP, and he's a friend of mine of nearly 20 years standing, which is why he was kind enough to make me this offer before the election to help me out, to tide me over at a time when I didn't have
So you don't pay a market rate?
At a time when I didn't have the resources to cover this purchase myself. But let me stress, it is not a gift, it is a loan. I will be repaying him with interest.
But you don't pay a market rate?
I'm paying the equivalent, according to the agreement that we made, of a Midland bank standard base rate interest, yes.
So your worry was that you wouldn't get the money from the bank, not that you were getting a lower interest rate, is that what you're saying?
No, my concern is that having got a building society mortgage, I needed additional help, and Geoffrey was kind enough and generous enough to offer that to me on a short-term basis.
When will the money be paid back?
I hope shortly, because I'm now in a better position in relation to my family. Resources are available to enable me to do that. It had always been my intention to do that. It was always my understanding in the personal arrangement I made with Geoffrey Robinson that it would be paid back when I was in a position to do so. And I'm now in that position, and I believe I will be able to do so shortly.
Did you consider either paying the money back or declaring it, either at the time you were elected in 1997 or at the time you became, when you went to the DTI in the summer of this year?
I would needed to have declared it if there was a potential conflict of interest. But that was removed from me, that potential conflict of interest was removed from me when my permanent secretary first told me in September, not as Mark Mardell said when I was appointed, that the DTI was going to have to examine certain aspects of Geoffrey Robinson's business affairs. In the same breath, he advised me, recommended to me very strongly, although he didn't really need to do that I and no other minister at the DTI should involve ourselves in the examination of the affairs of a colleague, of a fellow minister. I immediately accepted that. I have had no involvement in the substance of this examination since. No papers have been referred up to me. I have engaged no official in any discussion at all. All I have done as a matter of courtesy is to acknowledge to Conservative opposition spokesman that the matter is being considered by the DTI. I've done that twice as a courtesy to the opposition spokesman, but on the substance of the matter, I'm satisfied that having insulated myself entirely from the DTI's activities in relation to Geoffrey Robinson, no conflict of interest arose, and therefore there's been no infringement of any ministerial code.
Fine, but if you consider you insulated yourself from a conflict of interest by not taking part in this inquiry, why didn't you tell Tony Blair? Why did he only find out about this last week?
Because I didn't really feel that I needed to disclose something which was a personal arrangement made between myself and Geoffrey Robinson 2 years ago.
You're one of his closest advisors.
2 years ago, before the election had taken place. If I had thought that any conflict of interest arose in relation to it, of course I would have referred to it. I would have notified my permanent secretary. But my permanent secretary, and the action that he took, and the acceptance and ready agreement that I made, that I and no other minister in the DTI should be involved in this matter, removed that potential conflict of interest. Having satisfied myself that no conflict of interest arose in this matter, I did not believe I needed to refer to it. I have to say to you, though, given the mud that The Guardian and others are starting to throw around, which I intend not to allow to stick to me, which is why, let me have my say.
You don't want to stick to you, but if there's no conflict of interest, why has Tony Blair now asked the chief cabinet, the cabinet secretary, to look into this potential conflict of interest?
He has indeed already done that. But
why has he done that?
The point I was going to make to you was this.
But sorry, why has he done that?
The reason
if there's no conflict of interest, why has he done that?
Because he wants to satisfy himself and programmes like your own and newspapers like The Guardian, which obviously wish to throw this mud around and make these allegations.
Well, he clearly isn't convinced, is he?
That no conflict of interest arises. Now, if you want to put that to Number 10, you can do so, and I've seen the statement that Number 10 have issued this evening, and the Prime Minister has expressed his complete confidence that I was entirely insulated from any matter relating within the DTI, any matter, any examination of Geoffrey Robinson's affairs. And that's exactly how it should be, because no conflict of interest could be permitted to arise in the exercise of my ministerial duties. None has, and I am absolutely confident that none will in the future. And I say this to you, the Guardian and whoever wants to throw this mud around or make these allegations, well, newspapers will be newspapers and they can do so. I satisfy myself, my department and my conscience that in the exercise of my ministerial duties, no conflict of interest should arise. It hasn't, and none will in the future, in relation to Geoffrey Robinson or any other matter which I'm involved with.
But the problem, Mr Mandelson, is that when you came to power, New Labour was going to be not just whiter than white, but seemed to be whiter than white. We're now in a position where you, a prominent politician, takes a huge loan from a businessman who then turns up in a senior position in your government, which is going to raise questions in people's minds, where you exclude yourself from an inquiry and where you don't tell Tony Blair, who after all is one of your closest friends, never mind one of your closest colleagues, about this, until a week before the Prime Minister has to then order the Cabinet Secretary to look into it. It just doesn't look good.
Well, that's the way you're choosing to present it, and I understand why you are. But you see, the point is that when allegations like this get thrown around, and when mud gets thrown in this way, my job and every other minister who finds himself in this position is to put the facts squarely to the people, to make a completely open, clean breast of what has happened. And I have to say, if I had known allegations like this were going to be made, with the benefit of hindsight, I think I would have preferred, and ideally from my own point of view, it would have been better if all the facts of this matter had been got out. Then the opportunity wouldn't be there for The Guardian or anyone else to throw around this sort of mud. And I rather regret, in that sense, that the facts weren't out. However, the substance of the matter is clear.
So you should have confessed this sooner. That's what you're saying.
No, I'm not saying.
You just said you regret not doing it.
No. The word confessed is your word, and I understand why you're trying to place this construction on my words. Because you are playing, you're playing a good game. From the public's point of view, what is important is that in the fulfilment of my ministerial responsibilities, I am absolutely confident, and I have satisfied my own permanent secretary, as well as the Prime Minister, that there has been no conflict, no potential conflict of interest arising in the exercise of my ministerial duties. Had that not been the case, then I would indeed have a case to answer. I don't. There has been no infringement of any ministerial code, and I have taken this early opportunity of coming on yours and other people's programmes.
If there is shown to be a conflict of interest, will you consider resigning?
Vigorously to refute the allegations that have been made, because they have no standing, no substance in fact, and people need to be reassured that whatever mud others might choose to fling around...
If the Cabinet Secretary considers there's a conflict of interest, will you consider resigning?
There is no conflict of interest, therefore the matter does not arise.
The matter of resignation doesn't arise?
I am absolutely determined to make sure that when people make these allegations, they are properly refuted by me with the use of the facts, and that is what I'm doing this evening.
All right, Peter Mandelson, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much indeed.
Now, if Bill Clinton and Tony Blair were expecting a chorus of approval from around the world for their strike against Iraq, then there will be disappointed men tonight. There have been demonstrations across the Middle East. 3 of the 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council are either against it or studiously non-committal. And even some of the British tabloids, usually reliable when there's a war on, are asking what this has achieved. Here's our diplomatic editor, Mark Urban.
What we have done is put him back, secure, firmly in the cage. He is weaker, and therefore the region is stronger.
Yesterday, the Prime Minister spelled out his strategy of containment. Today, Mr. Blair and his Foreign Office team went on the offensive with the message that they were going to build international support for their campaign to keep the Iraqi dictator under pressure.
I have said this morning that with the end of the military campaign, we will now commence a diplomatic campaign to build the broadest possible consensus in the international community to stop Saddam from developing weapons of mass terror.
If this campaign is to succeed, they'll have to produce results at the UN Security Council in New York, where today there was no hiding the degree of division among its permanent members.
I think it is not helpful that the Council is divided, and I would hope that in the weeks ahead we will find a way of bringing everyone together so that we can carry on the essential work of the Council.
Today, the Iraqis took reporters to see what they said were shattered civilian buildings in the southern city of Basra. So, what about the damage caused by the strikes in the game to reach agreement in the Security Council?
There must be some healing of the wounds inside the Security Council. We are, in fact, in a very serious situation where the United Nations no longer really provides a vehicle through which we can articulate a global policy, and where the main players in that global policy are now themselves at odds, and where there is no clear way forward that will be acceptable both to the two sides in the United Nations or indeed to the object of their attentions, Iraq.
And if Saddam is now in a cage, the withdrawal of the UNSCOM weapons teams means we have no means left of looking inside it. The Baghdad leadership today reiterated its objections to any return of those inspectors.
The aggressors, they should be accounted for this aggression. Then, and with that, the embargo on Iraq should be lifted. I told you here in our last meeting, Iraq cannot tolerate the embargo and UNSCOM. Then the aggression was added. So, if anybody wants to find a political solution, this is the legal and political solution to the current situation.
UN aid workers will go back to Baghdad tomorrow, but not UNSCOM. Despite the tough talking by Britain and America this week, UNSCOM has always been dependent on Iraqi cooperation.
So if there's to be any kind of inspection system in Iraq now, it has to be handled with the cooperation of the Iraqi side. After all, the UN Special Commission on Iraq only worked because there was a degree of Iraqi cooperation. Of course, there were difficulties, there was deception being practiced and so on, but nevertheless there were inspectors on the ground and there was a degree of cooperation.
And if Iraq wants to tough it out, what danger that Saddam's cage will not confine him, as countries like Russia turn a blind eye to sanctions busting.
Les Américains et les Anglais.
The French are now energetically putting their own view forward. Mr. Blair and his advisers are furious, but President Chirac has seen an opening for a fresh approach.
The French believe, on the one hand, that sanctions should be removed, on the other, that UNSCOM should be reconstituted. And undoubtedly, in that reconstituted UNSCOM, France will play a far greater role than it did in the past. And that will minimize the British and American presence, the very thing that the Iraqis objected to. Now, if the French position is accepted, then indeed the French will become full players in the Middle East, rather than the partial players that they've been in the past.
In New York, France will hope for Russian and Chinese support. But everyone is stymied by the deadlock in the Security Council. The Russians and French might want to start doing business with Iraq again, but there's 7 years of UN resolutions stopping them from doing it officially, at least. Equally, it's impossible for London and Washington to stick to the letter of those previous agreements, since everyone acknowledges the system has failed. It's most likely that the next move will be for the Big Five to agree to a comprehensive review of the whole issue, something the Russians actually called for 2.5 weeks ago.
If there was a comprehensive review now, all the information to hand, and then a judgment made, and I suspect it inevitably would be Iraq still to deliver more information. And then I imagine a bargain has to be struck with Baghdad to say this information is lacking. These steps have to be taken. When that is taken, then perhaps some kind of commitment is made over sanctions.
And what sort of bargain will Britain and America accept? Well, it may be one which today, in the afterglow of military strikes, seems surprisingly poor. Some people have been talking about a wider cage. UNSCOM moves from inspection to monitoring, occasional visits to suspect facilities. The embargo on Iraqi oil would be lifted, and if that sounds like everything going Iraq's way, it might be the price needed to keep Russia, France and China committed to a continued embargo on weapons sales to Iraq. After any deal, London and Washington will still be able to say that Iraq has been stopped from threatening its neighbours. But that job was really done in 1991, when 400 times as much explosive was dropped on Iraq as during the past week.
That was Mark Urban reporting. Well, earlier this evening I spoke to the Foreign Minister, Derek Fatchett. I began by asking him about newspaper reports that some RAF Tornado pilots didn't think that the bombings had actually had a significant effect on the situation in Iraq.
Changed the context quite substantially. Remember last week we were discussing the fact that we could not get on with the disarmament process. UNSCOM was hindered in all the work that it aimed to do. Well, we've achieved a good deal of that disarmament process. We've done it in a way that we didn't seek. We sought to do it by diplomatic means, but we've had to do it by the military option. But we have pushed Saddam Hussein back considerably as a result of this military action.
But it must at least concern you that some of your own pilots, I'm not saying all of them, but some of them are clearly a bit unhappy about all this and wonder what on earth the point of it was.
Well, I think they will reflect on the limited objectives we set ourselves. We've achieved those limited objectives. We were not in the business, and we made this abundantly clear last Wednesday, of trying to capture Baghdad or to have any ground force exercise. It was a very limited objective. We've achieved those objectives, and in so doing, I think we have achieved what we set out to do, and that is to push back the weapons of mass destruction program, to give greater stability and security to Saddam's regional neighbours. And I think at the same time, contrary to what a lot of people say, we have weakened his hold on Baghdad and on Iraq, because what it now shows is that despite all the bluster, despite all the claims subsequently, he cannot protect those elite forces immediately around him, and I think that will weaken him.
What you have lost is UNSCOM. Tariq Aziz said this afternoon, again, I'll just quote you, "This UNSCOM were the victims of the American and British aggression. It's not our job to bring them back to life." Now, given that today the British government has been saying you want to put UNSCOM inspectors back in, you had them there before, in some sense. In that sense, the objective of this operation has failed.
No, because we've done some of UNSCOM's work for them, a very substantial amount of UNSCOM's work. At the same time, we do not see Tariq Aziz as the last word on this. Let me remind you that if there is to be ever a lifting of sanctions, Iraq has to be in compliance with the Security Council resolutions. Those Security Council resolutions demand that UNSCOM and the International Atomic Energy Authority are in a position to give Iraq a clean bill of health on nuclear weapons, on weapons of mass destruction, on missiles. Now, without UNSCOM, Iraq cannot be free of the sanctions. So it's in Iraq's interest for UNSCOM to get back. I understand Tariq Aziz's bluster at this stage, but the reality is if he and the Iraq leadership want to move forward, then it's important that UNSCOM gets back, and that is clearly one of our objectives.
But if the Iraqis are saying we won't let inspectors in, and at this stage, after your military action, they've got the maximum motive to cave in if they want to, then in what sense is Saddam Hussein back in his cage, as the Prime Minister said?
Well, he's back in his cage because what Saddam Hussein knows is that we are then in a situation where if there is any move towards threatening regional neighbours, if there's any move towards rearming and rebuilding that capacity for weapons of mass destruction, we will use force, and we've said that. The Prime Minister made that abundantly clear yesterday. What we are seeking to do now...
Is that a phrase you regret on reflection?
No, because what we are saying is that we are limiting his capacity, and we are talking now about the possibility of getting a new diplomatic framework in which we can organise our relationships with Iraq. That new diplomatic framework takes into account the context of what has already been achieved militarily over the last few days. We're not now dealing with the same situation as a week ago. Iraq is weaker and has to listen to what is going to come from the international community.
Well, talking of new diplomatic frameworks, I mean, what now seems to be up for grab as well is the whole oil embargo. I mean, let me just read you what Hubert Védrine, the French foreign minister, said on French radio this morning. He said, "I would say the embargo is aggravating the suffering of the population, that powerful people in the Iraqi regime get round it and use the situation to engage in illegal dealings from which they benefit. At the same time, it allows the regime to say, look how we are being persecuted by the USE. We, for our part," that's the French government, "believe that we should move towards a lifting of the embargo."
Well, we've said that we will continue to enforce the sanctions, but we have said at the same time that we need to look at the help that we can give to the ordinary people of Iraq. I think those circles can be squared. It's very interesting today that in his meeting with...
But you'd accept it is a circle which has to be squared. I mean, clearly what you're saying is not the same as what the French government is saying.
Well, I think the real concern, but which we have, which the French have, and I was going to say in his meeting today with the German Minister, Fischer, the Germans also reflected, is the need for us to make sure that Oil for Food programme works effectively, that it gets across to the ordinary people of Iraq. Now, that we've got to be creative on that, we've got to have some new thinking, but there cannot be any question in our mind that there should be an immediate lifting of sanctions, because what we're then doing is rewarding Iraq for a lack of cooperation. If we're going to review the sanctions issue, then it has to be after a period of cooperation and a period of compliance, so that we know that we are making progress.
Was the action you took worth destroying the diplomatic consensus that was there? I mean, after all, the 5 permanent members of the Security Council, the French are now suggesting the embargo be lifted, the Chinese were against what you did, and the Russians have withdrawn their ambassador. What the Americans and the British have done has broken apart the international consensus that was there.
Well, the international consensus was strong in terms of the need to ensure compliance with the Security Council resolutions. We took action based on the Security Council resolutions.
Well, on your interpretation of them.
I think we can recreate that.
Clearly isn't the Russian interpretation, or the French, or the Chinese.
But I think we can recreate that consensus around the need for compliance. There is no disagreement between us and the French that we have to achieve our 3 objectives: containment, disarmament and assistance to the people of Iraq. Now what we need to do is to work out in detail how you take that program forward. That is a United Kingdom program. It's the one we've talked about for some time. I think we share that with the French. We need to work out the details, build that consensus. I don't think we've broken that consensus. Amongst the Security Council members, there is still a very strong view that Iraq has to be in compliance and has to cooperate with the international community.
That was Derek Fatchett, the Foreign Office Minister, talking to me earlier. There was a bit of good news for Bill Clinton today, and let's face it, at the moment he needs all the good news he can get. 2 former presidents, Gerald Ford and Jimmy Carter, wade into the impeachment controversy by suggesting the president be censured but not convicted. Meanwhile, the White House is desperately trying to firm the idea up into something which could actually save the president's skin. Peter Marshall is in Washington.
Jingle bell, jingle bell, jingle bell rock, jingle bells.
Happy Christmas, Mr. President. Accompanied by seasonal tunes, Bill Clinton, history maker, appeared all smiles at a Washington soup kitchen. Having consumed his own humble pie, Mr. Clinton is apparently more popular than ever. 73% of Americans now approve of the job being done by this impeached president. But that may count for nothing among senators, who has to coax and cajole for mercy. For that, Hillary is back on board, together again, defiant against adversity. At the White House, we met Lisa Caputo, Mrs. Clinton's former aide and close friend, who'd been with the First Lady during the impeachment hearings.
I would say that Mrs. Clinton has been quite clear about her feelings about this. It was not the easiest day of her life when her husband came forward and addressed the American public that he had misled them. She herself was misled. However, she has been very clear about her commitment to her marriage and how much she loves her husband. She is a fighter to the nth degree, and I think that she will continue to fight, be supportive of her husband, and be very protective of her family, and be very engaged.
The fight back started within 2 hours of the impeachment vote. The Clintons, flanked by the massed ranks of congressional Democrats, said once again they'd be going nowhere until his full term was completed. And then, in characteristic style, the president defined his new mission.
It is something I have felt strongly all my life. We must stop the politics of personal destruction.
The politics of personal destruction, as practiced by Hustler magazine's Larry Flynt, had just claimed its biggest scalp, the Republican Speaker resigning over Hustler's revelations of his multiple affairs.
I will not stand for Speaker of the House on January 6th.
So, yet another casualty, and even the hard-bitten members of Congress are starting to flinch. The impeachment vote was the culmination of the most vicious partisan fight. For this entire saga, from January to December, has stripped American politics bare. Now, faced with the consequences of what they or their colleagues have done, Congress members, senators and the White House are coming over all statesmanlike. Their new watchword is comity, a quaint term meaning mutual courtesy. In fact, they're trying to do a deal. Back at the White House, we heard from a unique figure, a retiring Democratic Congress member, Chuck Schumer, who's voted at every stage against impeachment and will do the same in his new job as a senator.
We think he's done wrong. We think he should be punished for it, but we don't think it should be impeachment, and we don't want a narrow, partisan majority telling the rest of the nation that it's their way or no way.
Whatever the rights and wrongs, though, how can he lead anybody with all this going on, with a Senate trial going on?
Well, you know, It's unfortunate if the Senate trial goes on, but the president was in the Middle East a couple of days before the vote doing that, and this is a man, no one has doubted his energy or his ability to do several things at once. If anything, I hope he'll pay more attention to what's going on in the Senate than he did in the House, because this impeachment proceeding almost crept up on him. And I think he should be thoroughly involved in the Senate process to make it as short and, from his and the nation's point of view, as successful as possible.
It's not helpful to domestic affairs, and certainly not to foreign affairs, is it?
Well, no, but you'll have to ask Trent Lott his view of that, because none of us want this trial. It's Trent Lott and the Republicans that are doing it.
Mr. Lott is the hardline Republican leader in the Senate, but his members are relatively independent-minded. Today, we canvass the views of two of them. Ideally, do you want a full trial, the whole thing, or do you want the president to resign? What would you like to happen, ideally?
Well, I think the president should resign. I think he has shown a lack of respect for the office, and he's undermined his capacity to govern. But he's not going to, and so certainly that's not going to occur, it appears. So I think we have to proceed into a trial, and once we get into that process, I believe you'll see a coalescing of opinions, and there may be 51 votes to dismiss the action.
Do you think at this stage he's going to escape expulsion?
Removal from office? Well, I don't think there's 67 votes today to remove him from office, that's for sure. But as you get into these things, they obviously have a dynamic of their own. I wouldn't have presumed he would have been impeached by the House, so these things have a dynamic of their own once they begin.
If you get into the trial...
Then we turn to Utah's Orrin Hatch, a man who might still be open to a deal, but first he says the White House must stop those old politics of personal destruction.
You have to ask yourselves, well, who's doing this dirty work? Is it just Larry Flint? Or is Larry Flint being fed the information by people who have been out there doing this work all along? Because this administration is known for this type of stuff.
Whatever happened to comity?
Well, I'd like to see more. That's one reason why I'm suggesting that we have to approach this in a very fair, very positive, and very decent manner. I think we have to bend over backwards for the president. My own personal standard in impeachment is beyond a reasonable doubt. They'd have to prove his guilt beyond a reasonable doubt before I could vote for impeachment. But there's another part of that standard, too. I will not treat him any differently than I would a Republican president under the same circumstances. And that's a pretty important standard to me. On the other hand, I better give a warning. I'd be pretty tough on the Republican president.
Looking at the man, you wouldn't have any clue as to what's going on behind the scenes or within his own formidable brain. Bill Clinton has an enormous and unprecedented crisis to tackle. Happy Christmas. He's facing a hellish new year.
Peter Marshall reporting from Washington. Well, as we've just seen, it's seen the vote to start impeachment proceedings against an American president for the first time this century. But over here, 1998 has seen the first full year of a Labour Prime Minister for the first time in 2 decades. When it comes to the realities of power, Tony Blair has had a fulsome dose of his own recipe of education, education, education. Mark Mardell is back again to review the past 12 months in politics.
Two years after electoral victory, is Tony Blair still master of all he surveys, unchallenged? Well, certainly not by Paddy Ashdown, who seems cock-a-hoop to be locked into the Blairite project, even if sometimes it makes him look less like a partner in power and more like one of the spoils of victory. Hardly challenged by William Hague, he is a parliamentary bruiser, but he leads a dwindling band of Eurosceptics, and many of them would prefer another leader. Free of the burden of an effective strategy, Mr Hague now numbers the party's biggest hitters among the enemy. As for his friends, well, the Conservative leader seems to think the role of the opposition is to defend the indefensible. No, this year it wasn't the opposition parties who landed the blows on Mr Blair, but his own side. When Harold Macmillan was asked what the most difficult thing was to cope with as Prime Minister, he replied, "Events, dear boy, events." And it was events here on Clapham Common that led Ron Davies to resign as Welsh Secretary. Whether he did, whether he didn't, whether he wanted to or not, he still had to go. And that had consequences, dear boy, consequences. Not one who likes to lose control of the situation, Mr Blair ordered one of his own to replace the disgraced minister and conquer Welsh hearts and minds. The obedient, if unenthusiastic, Alan Michael is facing a party already breathing heavily and getting rampant about London bossiness. So Mr Blair may yet get a roasting by proxy in February's elections. The Scottish Party is also showing recidivist tendencies, but here the danger to the government is even more acute. With the Nationalists making an independent Scotland look like a real possibility, the government took a decision to no longer ignore them, but to tackle them head-on. But final victory appears to be eluding them for the moment. Mr Blair is learning the uncomfortable truth that if you give people freedom, the ungrateful blighters might actually use it. His desire to have new Labour types in power everywhere is seriously undermined by his commitment to devolution. Sooner or later there'll be a person or tendency or party in power that he doesn't approve of, but also can't ride roughshod over. Indeed, we might get a taste of things to come by looking to the continent. There's the terrifying thought that all of Mr Blair's conquests may be for naught. Across the water, the Hunnish hordes and Gauls, or at least Schroeder, Lafontaine and Jospin, have raised the spirit of Keynes and are celebrating the joys of the sort of socialism that Blair banished from Britain's shores. Their stress on a different sort of euro may be rather difficult for our government to swallow. Mr Blair's allies make his enthusiasm for Europe that much more difficult, at least for a politician who's so keen on stressing that his is a new way, a third way. And are we any clearer what all that means? Well, Mr Blair came out only last week. He admitted the third way is a sort of resuscitation of Gladstonian liberalism, updated for the new millennium. The grand old man, the inventor of ethical foreign policies, was Prime Minister 4 times over a period of 26 years. But is Mr Blair that durable? After all, recent events suggest Mr Blair's following another 19th century model, Palmerston, the doyen of gunboat diplomacy. It's noticeable that while going to war enhances most politicians' reputations, the paint seems to be peeling off the otherwise invincible Mr Blair after last week's air attacks on Iraq. So, do any other problems loom? The gods do still smile on Mr Blair. He still looks pretty in purple and is the one and only emperor. Gordon Brown may have imperial ambitions, but shares the same vision, and Robin Cook is in no position to set an alternative. What is striking is that no one is offering a coherent alternative. The weakness, though, of Mr Blair's project is still the paucity of independent true believers. They'll need more than blind obedience if a dodgy economy, awkward Europeans and difficult elections all loom next year.
That was Mark Mardell reporting. Well, to discuss the last year in politics, I'm joined by Anthony Hart of The Times and Michael Brown, former Conservative MP and now reborn as columnist for The Independent. But before we talk to you two, just a quick look at the main story, which we were talking about earlier, about Peter Mandelson, which is now turned up on the front page of tomorrow's papers. I don't know if you can see it there in The Guardian. Mandelson, the minister, and the secret £373,000 loan, it says. The Guardian, in fact, broke this story. It says underneath, Blair and Whitehall not told about deal for 2 years. The Mirror, which also claims they broke the story, but apparently didn't. Exclusive ministers and secret house deal. It says Robinson's £370,000 loan for Mandelson. And the Telegraph doesn't actually have that story on the front of it. It's not the edition I have. It does in the Mail. Mandelson and £373,000 loan storm. Industry Secretary borrowed cash from Geoffrey Robinson. Michael Brown, you had the Trade Secretary earlier on. Is this a flash in the pan, or do you think there's a real problem here?
I think he'll get away with it, but it's an embarrassment, and it certainly brings forward the day when Mr Robinson is going to leave the government. It's messy and it's murky, but I don't think Mandelson's going to resign over it.
Tony Howard?
I don't think he's done anything improper. He may have done something unwise. That's a different matter. I think that if he had declared this, as he almost said in his interview with you, in retrospect, I wish I had.
Well, he said he regretted not doing it, in a sense.
So I think that does look a bit odd. And I think it's especially odd, oddly enough, that he never told the Prime Minister. He and the Prime Minister are like that. And I do find it very odd that he never found an occasion of saying, by the way, Tony, I ought to tell you that. Very strange.
Now, looking at the more general points Mark was raising there, Michael, this point about power that Mark was making, that one thread that runs through Tony Blair, still very popular, but a certain intolerance to face any opposition, although he's not had any concerted opposition to face. That's starting to change, isn't it? I mean, you're going to have a Scottish and Welsh Parliament set up by next year, which he may not do exactly what he wants. Europe's getting a bit feisty as well. How do you think he's going to deal with that?
I think he'll come through it all right. He's got problems. I think what the country likes is the fact that there is a Prime Minister with his hands firmly on the steering wheel, and for that I pay him great credit. As somebody who's still an arch Thatcherite, I like the idea of Prime Ministers in charge and in control. The problem he has is that he will unnecessarily go in for all this control and unnecessary control freakery when he is so obviously in command of the political landscape. He doesn't need to do all that, and I would advise him as the months go by to loosen up a bit. He's plainly earned the plaudits of the country. He's miles ahead in the opinion polls. The Tories are absolutely no threat to him, and I think he can afford to loosen up a little bit.
Yeah, is there any, Tony Howard, to be such a control freak when no one actually threatens you?
Well, I'm not sure he is a control freak. I think he's educated by those years. He, after all, came into the House of Commons in 1983, so he lived through really the dim, dark days of Labour in the wilderness. And I think he does put a great premium on loyalty and unity. I think he may have taken it too far. Oddly enough, old Jim Callaghan was rumbling away the other day, saying, you know, better not report me on that or I'll be in trouble, he was saying. He doesn't like this sort of bleepers and all that. And I think that Blair ought to pay attention sometimes to the wisdom of older people and not say, you belong to old Labour, you lost 3 elections in a row, don't tell me how to run the country. I think that's a bit arrogant.
I want to ask you, because we don't have that much time left, about Europe. We've seen this spat between Gordon Brown and Oscar Lafontaine, between the British government and the German government over the last few weeks. We have got a new generation of political leaders in Europe who don't necessarily have the same politics as Tony Blair, who's going to find himself outside the Eurozone. How's that going to pan out over the next year?
I think history will say that the great mistake that Tony Blair made was not to take the tide at the flood. When he came in, he was tremendously popular. He could have thrown his weight behind, saying, let's have the referendum, let's have it quickly, let's get this matter settled. I think when the history books come to be written, they will say that that was his great error, that he didn't seize his opportunity. In politics, you have to do that.
Michael Brown?
I go along with that because it's plain that he will never hold the referendum unless he feels he can win it. There is now an element of doubt as to when he will be able to win that referendum. He would like to win that referendum, I think, but at the time that he just got elected to power, he could have done anything and the country would have bought it.
But also the point now that if there is going to be more harmonisation of everything from taxes to economic policy in Europe, the euro he might be asking us to join might be a different beast by the time he gets round to asking us.
Well, that's his problem. I mean, he could strangle Lafontaine because he's been successfully, over the last few months, bringing on board this great coalition of the great and the good and the business community, and then suddenly public opinion has been frightened by the tabloid press picking up what Lafontaine has been saying and setting back the objective that Blair has been setting himself.
I'm sorry, Tony, we have to leave it there. We've completely run out of time. Tony Howard, Michael Brown, thanks very much, and that's all from Newsnight tonight. I'll be back with more tomorrow night. Until then, good night.
Do you think that modern pop is good music?
I don't know about it being good music, but it's an art form anyway.
The creator of the soundtrack to a generation, the man behind the Beatles.
John took Brian aside and said, hey, you want to deal with this group? I'm the guy you deal with.
In a major 2-part documentary, Arena profiles Brian Epstein.
How ruthless do you think you've got to be?
Not very. He just fired us, sir.
He was probably one of the sexiest fellas I'd ever met.
The word was queer, not gay. We didn't really have a problem with it. He never hit on me.
He actually cared for the community he served.
Arena starts Christmas Day on BBC Two.
Macbeth transposed to feudal Japan by one of the greatest directors in the history of cinema. Akira Kurosawa's Throne of Blood, showing tonight at 10:01. The high-tension drama of producing a new show now on BBC Two. Storyville goes backstage on the road to Broadway.